Hi everyone, it's Jim of Shiloh Kahal. And the question that I'm posing is, what is explicit in scriptures concerning when a day starts? What do we have from scriptures that is explicit? Well, first, let's define explicit. I have some definitions up for you to take a look at here. First of all, explicit is an adjective, and it describes a noun. So it really would be describing, say, an explanation. So explicit becomes an adjective for explanation. So we would have an explicit explanation, and that adjective would be the meaning of that adjective is that it is stated clearly and in detail, leaving no room for confusion or doubt. Now, explicitly is an adverb, and that would be used to say in the same where explanation is a noun, explain is the verb to the same concept, and explicitly would apply to that verb. So, we when we're talking about an adjective and a noun, we have an explicit explanation, and when we're talking about an adverb and a verb, we are dealing with an explicitly clear. We explicitly explain. Okay, so what do we have in scriptures concerning the day when a day begins that qualifies for explicit, where it is stated clearly and in detail, leaving no room for confusion and doubt? So what might an explicit explanation look like? Because I contend that there are no explicit explanations of a day, when it starts, when it ends, anywhere in scriptures or anywhere in not just the 60, the canon of 66, but in all of the extra scriptures that I've looked at, the hidden scriptures, those that were hidden from us that are now being found. And I haven't found it anywhere. And I don't think anybody else has either, because nobody's coming up with anything. So what might an explicit explanation look like? Could look something like this. Concerning the beginning and end of each calendar day, a day begins the moment the sun's orb has first disappeared below the horizon, and the day ends just as the last vestige or sliver of the sun's orb remains visible. That would be an explicit explanation, or an attempt at an explicit explanation. Here's an alternative explanation. Concerning the beginning and the end of each calendar day, a day begins the moment the first vestige or sliver of the sun's orb appears at the horizon and ends with the last moment of twilight before the sun's orb appears. I mean, those are just attempts to show what an explicit explanation might look like. In the absence of an explicit explanation, what are the options for us? Because that's what we appear to be left with. So we could have explanations that are not explicit, but are implicit or made implicitly. And the definition of implicit is that it is suggested, though not directly expressed. Okay. But that leaves something for argument, because not everybody's going to, when it's not directly expressed, not everybody's going to receive the same implicit instructions or implicit meaning. I suppose it's possible that something could be clearly enough stated that everybody would agree on, I suppose. But that's one of the options. And implicit is an adjective, implicitly is an adverb. Implicit would be an implicit explanation, implicitly would be to explain implicitly. Now, infer is a verb. Inference is the noun of a verb. And to infer means to deduce or conclude something from evidence and reasoning rather than from explicit statements. So it's very similar to implicit and implicitly, in that to infer is to deduce from evidence when you don't have explicit statements available, and an inference is something a conclusion that you've arrived at from inferring. It's an inference. You have arrived at a conclusion not through explicit statements or facts, but rather through deduction and reasoning from the information that you had. Let me also define clear, because this is because what's happening is we have a contention then. Since we don't have an explicit definition of a day, what we have is contention between two competing explanations that are both implicit, they're arrived at implicitly, they infer or they are inferences, and they're competing on the basis, since they're not explicit, they're competing on the basis of which one is the most clear or which one most clearly describes and explains our options. And clear means easy to perceive, understand, or interpret. Clearly means to explain in a clear manner with clarity. So that's what we've got. We've got two competing explanations that are both either implicit or implicitly arrived at, and they are arrived at through inference, and then they're competing on the basis of clarity, and whether or not they are which one provides the best and most clear understanding in the situation we find ourselves. And let me introduce Occam's razor. I think most people know what Occam's razor is, but if you don't, Occam's razor is a principle in deduction that says, I'm paraphrasing here. You can do your own. I've got other videos where I put the actual Occam's razor out there. You can look at it if you want to, but basically it can be summarized as the simplest explanation is most likely to also be the correct explanation. So each of our explanations are going to be competing for clarity, and I will also say they will be competing for simplicity, because the more simple answer, the simplest explanation, the one that can be applied most simply, is likely to be the correct. It's more likely to be the correct explanation. And what we are the two competing ideas behind the start of the day is what is commonly referred to as evening to evening, but really it means the day starts with the evening, and we have to define evening, and it ends at the end of that day, which would be daylight. At some point we have to pick, when that day ends, but it would have to end by the time evening starts or at evening starts, because the moment evening starts, you've moved to the next day. And that is competing against a morning to morning, which is also probably improperly defined, because really a morning has to start. And let's just say that it has to start. Let's just say in this moment, that it starts when the sun breaks the sky and we get our first vestige or sliver of the sun's orb above the sky. And it's going to run then all the way through that 24-hour period of time. We go through night, and as the sun comes back around and it starts presenting sun rays and light into the sky, and we get daybreak, we're going to end up with this daybreak and this twilight period, where we start with astronomical, go to nautical, and then civil twilight, which is all happening as the sun is approaching the horizon. And it would end just before whatever you choose to be the start of the day. If it's going to be that break of the sliver of the sun's orb at above the horizon, then the end of the day would be the last moment in time where the sun is still completely obscured by the horizon. Those are the competing options, and they are competing for clarity and simplicity. And that's where I'll leave it here. You'll have to decide if you're interested in the subject at all. You're going to pay any attention to it. You need to evaluate the evidence on the basis of clarity and simplicity. And that's what my recent videos are all about. Is I am just trying to help everyone decide, which one. Now I fall into the area. I think that morning to morning is that the day starts with morning is the clear and simple explanation for just about everything I've looked at. And an evening to evening, or an evening start of the day, is unduly difficult. And by its complexity alone, it would maybe, according to clarity and Occam's razor, it would disqualify itself as the possible explanation. But I'll let you. I'm going to, in some of the videos I'm going to provide, I'm trying to explain the options and some of the opinions and some of the work of others. So with that, thank you, and may you be Baruch.